Hello everybody. So this is going to be a quick video in which I talk about sex differences in aggression. Okay, so in general, is there a sex difference between men and women in how aggressive they are? Well, decades and decades of research have given us a pretty definitive answer on this, and the answer is yes. Men are far more aggressive than women. Now, this is primarily true for one type of aggression, specifically physical aggression. All right. When we look at homicide rates, sometimes as high as 80% of all homicides are committed by men. Now, one thing that might shock you is that the number one victim of male crime is males. Males are the ones who are primarily, over 50% of the time, the victims of homicide. Well, we do know that women do commit homicide, but they don't do it very often. They do it, about somewhere between 10 and 15% of the time. And even for women, their number one victim, men. Men are the number one victims of all homicide. Women only kill other women very rarely. Okay. So why? Why do we have this sex or gender difference? And again, yes, sex and gender are different. They, more often than not, they do coincide with one another, but yes, they are different concepts, and so they can be inconsistent with one another. So a male may not identify as a man, a female may not identify as a woman, even though more times than not they do. But why is it that men are more physically aggressive? Well, if we look through the literature, we can get two broad explanations. One is provided by a whole host of research that kind of takes the approach exemplified by social role theory. Basically, the idea is that men are socialized to be aggressive and to react with aggression when they're faced with threats or problems. Women, on the other hand, are socialized to not be physically aggressive when they meet with problems, when they're met with problems. And so social role theory basically argues that the reason men are more physically aggressive is because they're taught to be. Now, another host of explanations is offered by an evolutionary approach. Now, the evolutionary approach doesn't say that social roles are unimportant. In fact, it would argue that they are very important. All right, and certainly social roles that are taught to men and women, to males and females by their culture are going to influence their aggression levels. All right, but according to the evolutionary approach, men have more to gain from aggression. All right, and they have more to gain in a couple ways. One is that by aggressing, they can establish and then defend their status. Now, by establishing status and defending that status, they get access to more resources like money, better job opportunities. They can also end up getting more access to women who are interested in being with them. All right, so they get more access to potential mates. And so the evolutionary approach then argues that the most basic or fundamental reason men aggress more is because they stand more to gain in the realm of reproduction. That aggression can help them gain access to mates. Now, that being said, status is also something they can gain through access through aggression, and greater status can then give them greater access to potential mates. So the most basic reason the evolutionary approach argues that men aggress is because it's one way they can get mates, either by accumulating status and maintaining that status, or by, more directly, by knocking off and killing off sexual rivals. Both of them work through that basic function of increasing access to reproductive partners. And some work suggests that both making men think about mating or making men think about their status can make them engage in more aggression. So some work by Kendrick and colleagues, in some work by Kendrick and colleagues, they either primed people with status acquisition. So they made them think about a scenario in which they were competing with someone for advancement at a job, or they made people think about the opportunity of finding a new mate versus a control. They had them think about something innocuous like looking for your keys. They found that when asked how likely they would be to engage in physical aggression in the scenario that they gave them, which was being at a party in front of other people, somebody spilling a drink on them, and not apologizing. When they asked how likely they would be to engage in several acts of physical aggression, men were more likely to say they would aggress compared to the control condition, compared to when asked to think about the keys, when they were made to think about status and when they were made to think about mating. So both of those made men more aggressive. But it only seemed to do it, well, with mating specifically, mating only seemed to increase aggression when it wouldn't impair their mating. So for example, when men were primed with mating and they were told that a drink was poured on them at a party where women were around, they didn't aggress more. But when they were primed with mating and told a drink was poured on them and the person didn't apologize and they were told that there were no women around, then mating made them when they were made to think about mating, they aggressed more than they did in the control condition. So if women are around and they saw men being violent, right, that actually could harm their reputation in the women's eyes, making it harder for them to find a mate. All right. But if women are around and they're thinking about mating, then they're potentially around other rivals. And so they need to fight those rivals. So when they're thinking about mating and they're insulted and aggression can't impair their chances of getting a mate, then they're more likely to aggress. So we know that status acquisition and mate acquisition are both related to greater aggression in men. All right. Now, that being said, again, that doesn't necessarily mean that the evolutionary approach argues that, well, men are just always going to be more aggressive and they're always going because they want access to reproductive partners. Because that's very often a very deterministic approach that people assume that the evolutionary approach argues. That's not it at all. In fact, the evolutionary approach argues that aggression is just one tactic among many. And in some situations, you can almost think of it like the nuclear option. All right. If there are no other ways to acquire a mate, that's when men use aggression. All right. But if they can smooth talk their way, if they can achieve status by maybe talking, in some cultures, men acquire status and can impress women by being more philosophical, right? And so the smart guys or the more philosophical guys or the more polite guys or, in religious groups that I used to run in, the more zealous guys, right? If the culture, if the context gives men an alternative way to attract mates, then men are probably going to compete to be good in those ways. They're going to try to be smart. They're going to try and be, if they're in a culture where being a philosophical thinker is valued, and they're probably going to try and be a philosophical thinker. If they're in a culture where being zealous and being, very religious is valued, they're probably going to try and be very religious. But when these other things are removed or they're not successful at acquiring women in these other ways, then aggression is a fallback. It's, again, that nuclear option. It's the last resort. And so this may be one of the reasons why we see greater aggression and indeed interpartner aggression in low-income homes. When income is low, a lot of these methods of excelling are limited. And so they're cut out of a lot of these alternative ways to acquire potential mates. And so they're left with nothing but the nuclear option. And so the evolutionary approach might give us one explanation as to why aggression is more common in impoverished areas. All right, guys, that's it for this video. As always, if you have any questions, please send them my way. If not, I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you later on.